everybody to this Google Hangout, the first of our Google Hangouts and Researcher Meet for the Animal Behaviour MOOC in 2014. Any students that would like to join us in the Hangout are welcome to do so. And for those of you that are watching the live stream, you're also very welcome to post questions that you might have or want to ask of our guest today, and I'll try and ask those for you. So the idea behind these Hangouts is to give students in the course an opportunity to meet researchers that are currently active in animal behaviour and find out a little bit more about what it's like to conduct research into animal behaviour, what sort of challenges that involves, and any other questions you might like to ask. So today we're very fortunate to have Professor Liz Tibbetts join us from the University of Michigan, and Liz is particularly interested in animal communication, which happens to be the theme of our lectures this week. Those of you that have already watched the video lecture that we posted on signal reliability and honesty, we're already familiar with one of the studies that we highlighted in that video, which was work that Liz conducted with Jim Dale on social policing. So before we start, I might just get some of the other participants in the Hangout to just introduce themselves, and then we'll turn to you, Liz. So can I start with you, Natalia? Could you tell us a little bit about where you're from and what's motivated your interest in animal behaviour?
Okay. I am from Russia, Siberia. It's pretty hot today, and it's pretty early too. So I'm a high school student, and I am interested in learning at all. And animal behavior is just one of those broad topics that I want to study. So I don't have special feeling about biology. I didn't have, but now I think more interested in those topics.
Great, thank you. Millie.
Oh, me, okay. Hi, I'm Millie Foley. I just completed my Master's at University of Melbourne, studying communication actually in black swans, looking at their bill coloration. And yeah, I found that the white stripe on their beaks is actually a signal of dominance. So I actually read a lot of Elizabeth's papers when I was doing my thesis. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you today, Liz.
Yeah, so I'm Liz Tibbetts, and I always have loved animals. When I was a little girl, I was deathly afraid of insects, but then I grew up and realized that they have really fascinating behavior. And I've been studying wasps for 15 years. Anything you want to know about wasps, I'm the lady.
So maybe start by telling us a little bit about that system. You worked on birds before, you studied fairy wrens. How did you come upon the wasp system, and how did you become interested in that?
Right, so when I was an undergrad, I actually went to Australia and I did a little field work studying fairy wrens, which are adorable little birds. And I loved it. I fell in love with the birds, but I decided that studying birds was too difficult. It seemed really... it seemed very challenging. It was hard to get a lot of birds to study, and sometimes we were doing a study where we had to kill the chicks, and I thought, oh my God, this is not something that I could do for a career. So I went with insects, and at first I was interested in cooperation, and social wasps are really interesting because they can either start nests alone or they can start nests in a group. So people wonder, hey, if they can nest alone, why would they ever choose to cooperate with others? Because when they cooperate, there's one individual who reproduces, and everyone else works and doesn't reproduce. So that seems like a terrible deal. Why would you join up and not get to reproduce and do all the work? So I was really interested in understanding how that behavior could have evolved. So I was videotaping a lot of wasp colonies. I would put little paint dots on their back and then videotape the colonies and observe the behavior of different individuals. And I accidentally had a videotape where 2 of the wasps were unmarked, so they didn't. I couldn't tell them apart. And so I was looking at the video very carefully, and I didn't want to throw the video away. And as I was looking at them very carefully, I realized, hey, I could actually tell them apart without the paint dots. And that helped me realize that they have really different markings. And so since then, I've been studying communication. And there are a couple different kinds of visual signals in wasps. So some of them have facial patterns they use for individual recognition. That means each has a different sort of face. They all look different, and they can learn to remember each other just like you and I can. They see a wasp and they say, hey, that's Judy. Memorize her face, and then next time they encounter her, they don't need to fight. And then there's another species. There are other species that have fighting ability. So strong wasps have different faces than weak wasps. And I compare it to body so, it conveys information about how strong they are, but it's a really interesting signal because it's kind of arbitrary. So it's different than a lot of animals have signals of how good they are at fighting. So a great example of that is antlers in deer. So having a bigger rack is telling everyone you're a good fighter, and it also makes you a good fighter, right? So those sorts of signals, it's really easy to understand how they develop and how they evolve because it's impossible to cheat. You know, you can't, if you grow a big rack, it makes you a good fighter and you're signaling that you're a good fighter. But these other signals that wasps and lots of other species have are more confusing because it seems like they should be open to cheating. So that's a topic I'm really interested in.
Yeah, this question of whether or not signals are cheap and therefore vulnerable to cheating is something that we've been interested too in the black swan system that we study, because the signal that the birds, or one of the many signals that the birds have, are these elaborate curled feathers that they have on their wings. And the more elaborate a ruffle of feathers you have on your wings, the more dominant you seem to be. But what you mentioned there sort of illustrated the challenges of asking questions in animal behavior and conducting manipulations or experiments that can really help you get at the question of how these things work. So we were very interested in the idea of social policing and whether that could work with these swan badgers as well. But trying to manipulate that signal was incredibly challenging in the field, so we had to try and catch birds and cut off curled feathers and replace them with straight feathers and glue those in and hope that they stayed stuck in the field, and then try and work out what kind of measure we were going to use to relate to that. So your system is beautiful in terms of how you can manipulate it. But I was struck when you were saying that birds were difficult to study, that it must be very, very challenging to do the sort of manipulations that you do, making microscopic paint marks on the faces of little wasps.
Yeah, I guess so. I used to think that I had quite a talent, and then I've had a lot of students, and it seems like they can all learn to paint wasp faces too. I mean, you certainly have to be very careful and hold them very still, and you have to have the right kind of paint, and it takes a little bit of a touch, but it's not really hard, And you don't have to worry about hurting them. Like, you accidentally kill a wasp. Well, It's not. I feel a little more guilty if I were studying a swan, I suppose. So yeah, it's not actually very difficult, and you don't actually get stung as often as you would expect. They're actually quite reticent to sting you, because they're so honeybees. Each honeybee is like, whatever, I don't care about my life. I'm just going to sting you because I'm so excited about protecting my hive. But paper wasps, each individual can reproduce, so they're very selfish. They don't want to sting you. They don't want to get in trouble. So they're safer to study. Excellent.
Now I'm conscious that I want to dominate the conversation, Natalie, so or Millie, so if you have a question, feel free to jump in at any stage. Is there something you'd like to ask now?
I'll see if Natalie wants to ask something first.
No, I don't.
Oh, well, I was going to ask, Liz, I know that you've done studies with individual recognition as well as stuff on dominance. I was just wondering if you could explain how you actually make sure that in your studies you're not that you know that the wasps are responding to the dominant signal and not because they recognize individuals, or vice versa when you do individual recognition studies?
Yeah, it's really confusing to have two different kinds of visual signals on wasp faces. It seems confusing. But at the same time, birds have all sorts of plumage signals, right? Some which are individual recognition, some which are dominant signaling, and for some reason that isn't quite as confusing for other people. So we've done experiments with the species with the quality signal, where we've tested whether wasps can remember each other. So you can do an experiment where you have wasps fight, and then you separate them for a while, and then you reintroduce them and see if they remember each other. So that's just a good way of seeing whether they have this recognition ability. And when you do that with the species with individual recognition, it works really well. They can remember each other well. If you change the faces, so the faces look different, they can't recognize each other anymore. So that tells you they're using the faces for recognition. If you remove face information, then they don't remember they met the other wasp before. In the species with a quality signal, you do the same experiment, and they just don't remember that they'd met the other wasp before. So that tells you that in the species with a signal of fighting ability, they just don't have that information. And and then in the species with individual recognition, we've done some experiments where we've looked to see if any component of the facial pattern is correlated with dominance, and it's not. So if it were a signal of fighting ability, you would expect strong wasps who win all the time to have a certain kind of face, and weak wasps who lose all the time to have another sort of face. But that's not the case. Strong wasps and weak wasps, they look the same. So that tells you that there's probably not information about their strength in the faces. And I mean, I find it kind of fascinating because the two different kinds of signals are, they're made up of the same pigments. They look similar in some ways, and yet they have very different developments, very different function. I think it's a really interesting example of how evolution can, push species down very different trajectories. Yeah, but they are quite distinct.
So is it possible that in a species a dominant signal could also function as an identity signal? Because I know in our black swans with the bill ornaments, the white stripes on their beak, they vary a lot between individuals, like the size and the shape, and also the colour. And we know that the proportion of white to red on the beak is a badge of status, a signal of dominance. But yeah, I was wondering if that could also play some role in identity signalling as well at the same time.
That's really interesting. It sounds like you're saying there are two different components of the beak that signal different information. So the size and shape of the whiteness is more identity information, and the other thing is quality information. So that totally makes sense to me, that could be possible. The thing is that, like, I feel like the type, the signal should look really different in identity signals and quality signals, right? Because identity signals, this is probably like way technical, but they need a lot more information, right? Like your face for individual recognition, there's a huge, like, faces are incredibly variable. While something like, redness in a bill, that might be quality information, and it varies continuously on one axis, So for that reason, I think the same trait, the exact same trait, is unlikely to signal quality and identity, but I can totally see how in your case, slightly different components of the same trait signal different information. And also, like, quality signals are condition dependent most of the time, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Like, the identity signals that have been studied, they're never condition dependent, and there's like some models talking about why that should be the case. So I feel like, yeah. But it sounds really interesting. I mean, sorry.
Oh, no, that's all right. Keep going.
But that sounds really interesting, and it totally makes sense that the shape of the whiteness could be really important. I think there was a neat study that came out recently on bird eggs. They were showing that, like, bird eggs that are really splotchy, the females are actually using them to, like, remember unique eggs.
Oh, I did see that. Yeah, to avoid cuckoos.
Parasitism.
Yeah.
Like individual recognition of your own eggs.
Yeah.
I like that idea.
Yeah, it's neat. Thank you.
I guess one of the puzzling things about the swan system is that this signal seems to be quite static. So when we were originally looking at the stripes, they seem quite invariable and they don't change much over the individual's life. And yet they seem to be correlated with dominance. And so that then suggests that something about that individual status laid down very in life and for the rest of its life.
Yeah, that's really weird and interesting and very. How long do they live?
Well, we don't know. I guess all people. It's one of those iconic birds that's barely been studied in Australia. But what we do know is that people that have kept pet swans, of which there seem to be a strangely high number in the US, for example, they can comfortably live for 15, 20, 25 years. So they're long-lived. And so I think that makes the problem even more perplexing.
Yeah. So how well correlated are they with dominance?
I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but it was very significant. Yeah, it was the proportion of white to red on the beak too. So I was measuring the total bill area from the culmen length of the beak using Photoshop, and then measuring the white as a proportion of that. So, yeah, but it was highly correlated. Yeah, I think the R-squared value was around 0.28 or something like that. But yeah, it was still highly significant.
So how do they determine dominance in their groups? Is it pretty static? Is there anything inherited about it, or do they really just fight with?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's inherited or not. Sorry, I've got my niece and nephew here. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's inherited or not, but they display their beaks to each other in these parallel swims. So it's usually two male swans, but they'll swim alongside each other and they'll have their beak sort of curled down like this, and they'll show each other their beaks, and eventually one of them usually backs down and the other one will attack. So I think there's some level of, learning in the population, so they learn who's dominant and learn to avoid certain individuals, that kind of thing. And they do appear to hold territories as well. So, but yeah, that's an area we need to look more into. So I didn't have enough time to do all that stuff.
Yeah. Too much to do.
I know, always.
At least theoretically, like status signals are supposed to be used between contests between unfamiliar rivals. Yeah. And individual recognition is more common, like when you're interacting repeatedly with the same individuals. So I don't know what the swan's life is like, but that might be interesting to learn more about. It's very bizarre if they have a signal that's static for 20 years and is highly correlated with dominance. That kind of blows my mind.
I don't know whether it is static, because I think that culmen length could potentially change. So they've got feathers that come down their head in like a V shape. So if those feathers sort of grow further down the bill or recede further back up to the top of the head, then the proportion of red to white on the beak would actually change over time. So if you've got feathers that grow further down your beak, then you're actually increasing the proportion of white to red on the bill, or it would be perceived that way anyway. So I'm not sure how. Yeah, I know that when I was doing repeatability measures of white and total, the size of the white, and total bill size, total bill area at culmen length over time, when I was doing those repeatability measures, total bill area had a much lower repeatability. So I don't know how. Yeah, I think I need to look more into that side of things. So yeah.
Well, interesting.
Yeah.
So you're going to go into the PhD?
Oh yeah, I could potentially do a PhD, but I think I'll move on to something else. I could spend all my life on swans, probably. You know how it is.
It's a lot of work. It's true.
So thinking about our global audience, I was thinking we might just pose a few more general questions of you, Liz, rather than indulging ourselves in a shared pet obsession, identity and quality signals. Just wondering whether you could maybe tell people about what a typical day would involve for you as a researcher in animal behavior.
Right. So it changes a lot as your career progresses. So when I was a graduate student, you spend some time taking classes. You spend a lot of time doing research. So that would be a lot of time watching wasps on videotape in my case, or out in the field collecting wasps or marking wasps, reading papers and trying to think of ideas, trying to think of what you want to do next. But over time, the longer you've been in science, the less time you spend actually doing any science. So now I don't really spend very much time with the wasps, but I spend a lot of time talking with students and kind of troubleshooting things that are going on in the lab. And most of my time is spent writing, reading, and thinking, and teaching. But this is summer, so it's all about doing managing wasp experiments and trying to make everything work. That's basically what I'm doing right now. But the interesting thing about when I started graduate school, my advisor told me that the strange thing about being a scientist is that you go from being a knowledge consumer to a knowledge producer. So for most of school, you just are learning information. People are telling you things, you're trying to remember it, etc. But when you're a scientist, the entire idea is you're going to come up with new information. And that's pretty exciting, right? So your entire job is to come up with holes in our current knowledge or things that you think are missing and try to fill them in or understand them, and that's pretty fun.
Yeah. Another, in terms of your career progression, are there any particular people that have been significant or inspirational in terms of driving your research direction?
Well, of course, your advisor, your graduate advisor, has a huge effect on how you think and how you do science. My advisor was Kern Reeve. He's a theoretician, so he taught me a lot about math, how to pursue science. But I'm trying to think. I should think of something. But there's no one person in particular that has really shaped the scientist that I am, I would say. But lots of good advice from lots of different people.
One of the things that I'm struck by as a researcher in animal behavior, and something that people often ask about, is it goes along the lines of, in a world with so many pressing conservation problems, isn't it a bit indulgent or esoteric to be studying animal behavior? Why aren't you curing cancer? What do you typically respond to that?
Well, I mean, there are lots of different answers. I mean, on one hand, the answer is probably yes, it is kind of self-indulgent. The world's not going to fall apart if we don't know, about wasp behavior or fairy wrens or whatever. But I think the idea is that we're learning things that are relevant to any species, right? And in many cases, this information is really useful for conservation. The things that I do personally, not so useful for conservation. But you certainly need to know a lot about animal behavior in order to save a species. You need to know, how big a territory does it need, or, all sorts of different information to make effective conservation decisions. So I think it can be useful for conservation. And one of the things that's really powerful about behavior is that I think it's incredibly integrative. So we're studying whole animals, and we can study them. We can think about how they have evolved, how they function in the ecosystem, like their role in the ecosystem. We think about what's going on with their physiology, with their brains, and we kind of put it all together to understand their behavior. So I think animal behavior is kind of a special role in biology because we think about all the different levels. And for me personally, I mean, I'm studying a wasp, but one of the wasps I study has facial patterns that they use for individual recognition, and they are specialized for face learning. So what that means is they learn faces differently than they learn other information, and that's parallel to how humans learn faces. So you might not know this, but there's a special part of your brain called the fusiform face area that's just for recognizing faces, and we learn faces better than we learn other visual information. And there are some people with deficits in this area, and it causes big problems. Like Oliver Sacks is one of the most famous examples. So these people can't actually recognize other individuals. It causes big social problems. In any case, this is like a long story on the way to the only groups known to have face specialization are humans, some primates, and wasps. So I feel so lucky that I discovered face specialization in wasps. And also, you can use wasps to learn more about face specialization. And you can do things to wasps that you could never do to primates and humans. And hopefully that will teach us things about what's going on in the brain, what kind of genes are activated, all sorts of things you can learn about face specialization, potentially using wasps that may possibly apply to humans. At least that would be the hope. So the idea is what we're studying in these animals is hopefully not only relevant to the animal we studied. If it was, I feel like it might be a little of a waste of time. But
that's a fantastic answer. And the other thing I think that's a common perception about research and maybe science in general is that in the media it tends to get portrayed as a solitary pursuit engaged in by brilliant individuals that have eureka moments. Mm-hmm. What's your experience of research? I guess one of the things that we are trying to get across is that it's much more of a team-based, interactive pursuit.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think different people have different scientific styles. So some people are more like the loners with their computer in their lab. But it's very, very rare to have a scientific paper where there's only one author, right? That's incredibly uncommon. Usually there's a huge group of people writing a paper, and they each bring their own different kinds of expertise. So yeah, I would totally agree. It's very, very team-based, and it's fun because you talk to people who have very different perspectives, and they kind of broaden how you think about your science. So it's very interesting.
Distinction is usually between the theoreticians and the empiricists. So your former supervisor as a mathematical modeler has probably got a string of sole-authored papers where they just sat themselves in a room and just nutted out a problem or developed a model for something and published that.
Yeah, although he tends, that's often the case for theorists. It's very true. They also think differently. I remember he used to just like write equations on the board and be like, "Isn't it all clear now?" And I'd be like, "No, you made it less clear." Yeah.
So the other thing that I'm just going to keep talking if nobody else wants to ask a question is what kind of advice would you have for somebody who's interested in pursuing a career out of studying animal behavior?
Well, I guess the best thing you can do is to get a bunch of research experience. So it depends on what level you're at, but the best thing you can do is try to get in someone's lab or get involved in science and see whether you actually like the process of science. So when I was a high school student, I remember I read all these books about people who would go to like the Serengeti and study the lion, and I thought, wow, that sounds really fun. And I was thrilled to discover people could actually do that for a career. And then when I went to Australia and studied fairy wrens as an undergraduate, I realized, hey, I actually like doing this. So that's the most important thing you can do, is be sure that you really enjoy it by getting hands-on experience. Because realistically, the day-to-day life of studying animal behavior, I mean, I think it's thrilling. I love it. I've devoted my life to it, obviously. And you can find out new information, things you never even imagined, so it's fantastic. But it's also a little bit repetitive, right? When you're actually doing the research on a day-to-day basis, you're like watching your 100th hour of WASP on videotape. You know, it's not a thrill a second. So, so that's why it's good to have some practice. Discover if you really love it before you jump in too far. And the other thing is, I mean, animal behavior is really fun, but biology is huge. There's so many different things to learn about, so it's important to figure out what's your favorite before you commit.
Yeah, and I think that is about trying a lot of different things to see which ones fit. And I think that it's wonderful if you have the opportunity as an undergraduate student or as a graduate student to volunteer on lots of different projects, because, as you say, it's better to get a sense of what you are, what you really enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I memorably remember Millie on a field trip that we had a third-year camp that we take out to a study site that's owned by one of our faculty here, sitting in a car banding ferry and saying, "Why would you want to be doing anything but this?"
Yeah, that was particularly awesome.
Well, I have lots and lots of undergraduates who work in my lab, and there are some who've run away and gone to medical school, and I feel, grateful that they've realized that medical school is where it's at. But others have gone the other direction, and I feel somewhat proud for turning them from something else to career in animal behavior.
Another thing that I'm curious to ask you about, Liz, is how do you manage the competing demands of academia, lab work, personal time, parenting, etc.?
Well, there's certainly a lot of discussion, at least in the US, about how in many cases there are not enough females in science, and people say one of the reasons for that is because it's difficult people think it's difficult to have a family and a successful career. But in my case, I have 2 kids, a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I actually think that science turns out to be a pretty good career if you, for having a happy family life. I mean, because it's very flexible. So there are certain things that you have to do at certain times, but nobody, for the most part, is looking over your shoulder and telling you have to be in the office from this time to this time. So that's really handy when you have kids. And I also think because of that, you're in a lot of your time, you're your own boss. So you can work very efficiently during the time you have, and then have other time where you're free of work. So, I mean, there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of discussion about how science it's pretty intense. You have to work really hard. You really have to love it. But I think it is very compatible with having a well-rounded life, complete with kids and other things to do for fun. I don't know. What do you think? Do you agree? Should it suck to your soul? And you think it's
I agree too. I think that I suppose a lot of the conversations that you have are with your academic colleagues, and those conversations sometimes revolve around the same worries about how everything is going to be done, the sometimes depressing cycle of applying for grants and having those grants turned down, and all the investment of energy and effort. But I absolutely agree with you. I think the flexibility of what we do, the fact that academics are highly self-motivated, I think it's amazing, really, to have organizations like universities run, trusting that people will do the very best they can, and they don't have to be told how to do it. They're highly self-motivated, and they're creative, and they do what they need to do. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a great job, especially now that Sorry.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
How often do you perform in public about your research, like this hangout?
Like this? This is the first time I've done this, but I teach pretty regularly, and that involves lecturing to groups of various sizes. And then part of your job is that you want it's supposed to be like an international community of scientists, so you go give talks about your research at various places, like other universities or conferences. And you go and, lots of scientists are standing up and giving little talks about their science, and everyone is talking about all the exciting things that are happening. So this sort of forum is completely new to me, but talking about your work is about science is something that you end up doing a lot. When I was, public speaking was not my forte when I was younger, and I probably would have cried to imagine that I would be teaching and regularly standing up in front of hundreds of students, but you get the hang of it. So that's not something that should stop you if you are interested in science.
Okay. If no one else has any other questions, I think we might wrap up the discussion. We've been talking for about 45 minutes. Maybe I could finish off with a sort of a more philosophical question about animal behavior. It's a field that's changing quite a lot in some ways, and is very much the way it always has been in other ways. There are technological advances that are happening that make amazing new things possible. You know, the things that we can do in terms of lab-based analyses are ever more sophisticated, and yet you can still go out with a set of binoculars and a notebook and do really exciting things. Where do you think? What do you think animal behaviour research will be like in 10 years' time, 15 years' time? Do you think it'll have changed much, or?
Well, I think it's important that it changes some and takes advantage of those fancy new techniques you're talking about. Everything from the great ways that we have of tracking animals now, that we can learn about their behavior through automated tracking mechanisms much faster, and using all these fantastic lab-based techniques to look inside their brains or to find out what's going on with their genes. I think it's important that behavior moves in that direction. But one of the strengths of behavior, I think, is when you take the time to watch an animal in its natural habitat, I think you can learn a huge amount about it that's relevant to many different areas. So, of course, I think it's important that behavior doesn't lose all of its low-tech, methods. I think it's important that people still spend a lot of time just watching animals. When I first started, I thought the only way to find something new, try a really fancy technique or a species that no one had studied before. But the longer I've been in science, the more I've realized how little we know. So even using the very simplest techniques, just binoculars, and studying a species that people have been studying for hundreds of years, there's still fantastic new things to discover. So I think that's something that's pretty cool about animal behavior.
I really agree with you about that, and yet there's a tension there, I think, in that natural history is good natural history is the foundation of some of the best questions, most interesting observations, and most weird and wonderful things that people have discovered, and yet a grant proposal proposing to study the natural history of some cool new species in a relatively speculative way will never get up. And so I often feel a bit saddened by how little time some people in the field of animal behaviour have for natural history. But I'm reminded constantly, especially by looking at the work of colleagues that have done amazing things that are really grounded in great natural history observations, of how important that is.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's definitely a challenge for our field going forward, how to figure out how to balance the importance of that with funding.
I think it will be encouraging for students to hear you say that as well, because they're all doing their own field notes blogs assignment at the moment where they are observing an animal of their choice. So it's good to hear people in the field of animal behaviour, saying that observation of animals is a really important part of animal behaviour.
Cornerstone. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Liz, thank you very much. I think it's been really enjoyable and also inspiring to have a chat with you about your research and your thoughts about animal behaviour. And I think the students will get a lot out of it too. So thank you very much for your time and joining in the Hangout.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.